Good morning, school. Mr. Summers here. I'm going to talk this morning and present you with some moral and ethical questions to get you thinking as we approach the end of the academic year. And I'm going to start that debate off by talking about or referring to a quote by Terry Pratchett, who is in actual fact one of my favourite authors. And that quote is, "People think that stories are shaped by people. In fact, it's the other way around, that actually people are shaped by stories." Now, before I became a teacher, just before I became a teacher, I trained and I thought that I would be a lawyer, and I trained to enter that profession. So in my training, I came across lots of what we called case law, which is basically stories that have happened and then that judges and courts have made a legal precedent as a consequence of the outcome of the stories and the judgments they've made. So a lot of my time studying law was about studying, in actual fact, stories, because those stories about people shaped society as it was. And there were two really interesting cases I found probably the most interesting stories and cases that I'm going to talk about to you about this morning. So I'm just going to get rid of my face and then go to the first case. So this is a case late 19th century called Dudley and Stevens, and it's a leading English criminal case which established a precedent throughout the common law world that necessity is not a defence to the crime of murder. Now, what does that mean? Well, let me tell you a story and it might make a little bit more sense. Dudley and Stevens were shipwrecked along with two other men, and they found themselves in a lifeboat. Dudley and Stevens, and they're in this lifeboat for some time, a number of weeks, and obviously they had very little food when they were shipwrecked, and they couldn't drink seawater because, as we know, to drink seawater, it is a fatal course of action. So they had no water and no food. After a few weeks at sea in this lifeboat, they decided they had no other option but to resort to cannibalism. And what they decided to do was to draw lots between the four of them for one of them to give up their life so that the other three would live. Dudley and Stevens are named in this case because they are the main protagonists. They came up with their idea and they had the intention to do so. Now, one of the other mariners, one of the other people in the lifeboat, was a young 17-year-old boy called Richard Parker. And Richard Parker was an orphan. He had no family, and obviously in those days what used to happen was they would find work aboard ships. Richard Parker had, by the third week in, already become delirious and near death anyway. So Dudley and Stevens decided that they would take a penknife and basically push it into Richard Parker's jugular and kill him, and then they would eat his flesh and drink his blood, which would then, in fact, save their lives. You've got to imagine that Dudley and Stevens are both family men. They have wives and families at home, and that they obviously wanted and felt it was absolutely necessary to take this course of action to save their own lives. And there's the first moral debate for you. There's four men inside this boat. Are they right to kill somebody who is near at the end of their life in order that the remaining three should survive? In fact, the three fed on Parker's body, with Dudley and the other man consuming the most and Stevens actually consuming very little. Dudley later described the scene and said that, "I can assure you I shall never forget the sight of my two unfortunate companions over that ghastly meal. We was all like mad wolves, who should get the most, and for men, fathers of children, to commit such a deed, we could not have our right reason. So they said he was not in the right frame of mind. He was not of sound mind when they did this. In actual fact, very shortly after they killed Richard Parker, as is often the case, they sighted a sail and were picked up by a German boat and returned to Falmouth, where they admitted their actions as because crimes that are committed at sea in international waters often don't find a home in the courts of justice in a particular land. Now, public opinion actually were very much behind Dudley and Stevens and said, look, if they hadn't done what they did, they'd probably have died. So the first moral question for us, or for you to think about this morning, if you were in their shoes, would you have done the same? If you were Dudley or Stevens, do you think it was right to kill somebody who was near at the end of their death in order to save your own life? So if you're in that situation, it was absolutely necessary to kill somebody else to save your own life. Would you do it? And I know there are some recent popular films that have glamorized this type of scenario, but this was a real scenario faced by real people in the late 19th century. And of course, we have to remember Richard Parker, and this is a picture of Richard Parker, was a human being. And interestingly, the name Richard Parker was used in The Life of Pi. Some of you, if you've watched that film, you know that Pi refers to the tiger on board his lifeboat. Taken quite a lot of the story of Dudley and Stevens into that particular lifeboat situation, and Pi calls the tiger Richard Parker. And at the bottom of the screen there, in the bottom right, you can see the actual lifeboat in which a photograph of the actual lifeboat that the murder was committed in. So, Dudley and Stevens were, although they had public opinion behind them, the courts ruled that actually there is no situation where you can take another person's life. It can never be necessary to kill somebody else in order to save your own life. You may disagree with that. You may say, well, actually, they had nobody. They had no other option but to do that, and to survive themselves, they had to take the life of another. And obviously, the court of law represents society, and they make decisions for society. So we can ask whether society was correct to punish Dudley and Stevens for their crimes. Dudley and Stevens were sentenced to the death penalty for what they did. It wasn't, in the end, it wasn't actually carried out, but that's what their sentence was. They received a lot longer terms in prison. So what's society, and what do you think? Do you think that Dudley and Stevens did the right thing, or do you think they did the wrong thing? Would you, in their position, take the life of another in order to save your own? And I'm just going to refresh your memories now. That case, that story came from 1884. So that was 130 years ago. That can bring you a bit closer up to date with my second case. I said there were two cases. Both of these really interesting, both looking at the necessity around taking a life. The second case I'm going to talk about is a case called Rie 2000. Obviously, the date is the date of the case. It's called Rie, and the letters like that are often used in case names where they refer to children, and you'll often see that. So in this case, as you can see from the picture, the visual imagery in front of you, there were what we now call conjoined twins. When I was growing up, I used to call them Siamese twins. And these twins were given the pseudonyms Jodie and Mary. So these are two girls that have been born and they've been their spines were fused together, so they were basically one body fused together, and they came from a relatively poor island and their parents brought the twins to the UK for a life-saving operation, because at that time the UK housed some of the most eminent experts in terms of separating conjoined twins and successfully separating conjoined twins. So it's for the parents, they had to try and save. They wanted to save their children's lives, but they also wanted to give them the best chance of a productive life. And they took the choice to bring them to the UK for an operation. Now, with this particular pair of twins, the way they were conjoined, it was medically proven that Mary was indeed what they term as parasitic on the existence of Jodie. That means that Jodie was the dominant baby, and that Mary's life was very much dependent on the existence of Jodie, who was breathing for both babies. And this was a really complex situation. There'd be massive reconstruction required. There were some non-functioning vital organs, and Mary was totally dependent on her twin for her life. Now, doctors had a really difficult decision here, because they investigated the possibilities, and they decided they came up with a couple of percentage chances of life, and they said that if they went ahead with the separating these two conjoined twins, Jodie and Mary, that Jodie would have a 94% chance of surviving, but Mary would only have a 6% chance of surviving. However, if they left them both as they are, they would both die within 6 months. So there's your moral decision. You're sitting in court of law. What do you do? It's necessary in these circumstances, the doctor said, to take the life of Mary, because she was virtually certain to die if they operated. Take the life of Mary in order to save Jodie. So what do? Do you let both babies die? Which was what, in actual fact, some commentators said the parents would want. The parents were very, very religious, and they felt this was God's way, and they didn't want the children to be separated in a way in which one of the children would die. They would prefer to have left them by themselves. So the doctors had to go to a court of law to get, obviously, a decision to go ahead with life-saving surgery for Jodie. So what would you do? Would you separate the conjoined twins to save the life of one, or would you leave them as they were, and the potential for them both to die in the next 6 months would be greatly increased? So this is what the court of law had to decide, and the question they had to ask themselves was, are the doctors right to want to take the life of Mary in order to save Jodie? Now you again can discuss that amongst yourselves, but the court of law had to make a legal decision in this case, and they decided that in actual fact it was right to save Jodie's life, to take the life of Mary. Now that of course raises lots of legal and ethical dilemmas, because it was ruled that it would be permissible to sever and thus kill in a palliative sympathetic manner the weaker twin to save the much stronger one. And this particular case was contrary to previous decisions like the one in Dudley and Stevens that I talked about earlier, where it said that you shouldn't, in any circumstances, it's never necessary to take somebody's life. And particularly in this case, because it was against the wish of the parents. But obviously, they did go ahead with surgery, and as expected, Jodie survived. Jodie's real name was Gracie. Um, Mary's real name was Rosie. So that's a really difficult story because obviously, for the family, because obviously, in undertaking that course of action, the doctors purposefully had to kill, or and that sounds really harsh, perhaps, but they purposely had to kill Mary in order to save Jodie. Now, in this case, you remember in Dudley and Stevens, Dudley and Stevens were sentenced to death for what they did. But in this case, where the doctors have acted with legal determination that they could do so, it was basically society allowing Mary's life to be taken, and the people who took it were then not punished. So, if you like, another ethical decision for you now, bearing in mind what you thought about Dudley and Stevens. Was society correct to allow the doctors to take Mary's life and then not punish the doctors for doing so? My view on this is that it's quite a tricky place to be, because if you start taking people's lives, and then you're pushing open a door which sometimes probably can't be shut that easily. So I've taken up quite a lot of time this morning with ethical and moral questions. I'm going to leave you this one. 130 years after Dudley and Stevens, we believe we now live in a civilized modern society, and that the progression that we've made is that we are now allowed. Is it right that we now allow a life to be taken when it's absolutely necessary to do so? Because 130 years ago we said no, that wasn't the case, and now the law is saying yes, you can do so when it's absolutely necessary to do so, and that's a very groundbreaking precedent to take. Okay, so I hope this morning has given you some food for thought, even if it's just sparked your enthusiasm potentially to ask yourself some of the bigger questions, and also to potentially get involved with the law. Maybe some of you want to go on to become lawyers yourself, so you can be part of the decisions that are taken for society. So, as I say, hope that sparked your imagination, got your thought process going ahead of the last few weeks of school. I hope you enjoy the last few weeks of school, folks, and I look forward to talking to you as you're in and around site. Okay, I'll hand over to Graham now.